I don't think we'll need to do too much housekeeping because there's not enough people, a lot of people here like the last time. Good evening and welcome back to the 16th edition of Gathering. Gathering is a monthly event that takes place, and it is my pleasure to be here with you as both a storyteller, an MC, and one who will be introducing you to some phenomenal people that are present. My name is Marilyn Torres, and I'm faculty for South Mountain Community College Storytelling Institute. It is truly, truly a pleasure for me to be here. One of the things that I wish to share with you, first and foremost, is I'd like to thank the producers for asking me back. I was here in October and shared some stories around the nature of doing things over again. This time we have an incredible discussion, one that is necessary and essential for these most interesting times. And the theme, of course, is associated with a phenomenal ASU project addressing incarceration, addressing law, addressing equity, addressing diversity, and addressing the nature of what do we mean as a society when we create laws. Who gets impacted, why, when, where, and how. And the speakers that we have here today are going to give some powerful personal and dynamic stories that I believe are going to give us some very rich things to think about. In the meantime, I'd like to share how I ended up kind of weaseling my way back into this session. Was because in a discussion that I had after the session we had in October, I began to realize that the subject matter was one that was near and dear to my own heart. And I graduated from John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City and was very much involved in examining the entire realm of the criminal justice system. I worked for 8 years in the Department of Anthropology, and part of my story will show you the transition I made in relationship to the law I chose to focus on. So with that being said, the housekeeping is that we will have our tellers tell. I will start out with the telling. We'll enter into a rich dialogue of questions, and we invite you as the audience to please online give us questions that we can engage in having a rich discussion, one that probably will not end here, but we hope that between what you hear here by our dynamic speakers, in this case we have the wonderful Rosetta Walker, a phenomenal woman who's done a tremendous amount of work in the Native American community as an indigenous woman herself. And we also have here a fantastic gentleman, Mr. King, who's going to talk about what it means to live through an interesting process regarding how the law addresses change within the community that he represents. And then we also have my incredible close friend, ally, spiritual brother, and great friend, Ceasar Santiago, who will give you a very phenomenal perspective about how the law works and who, in fact, takes the hit, so to speak, especially in the corporate world. So with that being said, let's get started. I want to at first share with you that the story that I want to tell you is one in which I'm going to weave this journey I went on as an 18-year-old when I was living in New York City, and I'm a 60s child, that should say it all, entering into the 70s and integrating 3 cultures that represent who I am. Most of the time when individuals ask me, well, what are you? I say, what do you mean? And pretty much they're really wanting to understand what I look like and therefore how they could define me. And I say I'm an intersectional person. I represent cultures, 3 very specific cultures. African descendancy through Nigeria. I represent Spanish descendancy through Majorca, Spain. And I represent Taino people that were indigenous in the islands of Borinquen that most people know as Puerto Rico. So therefore, as an intersectional person, I didn't necessarily have the luxury to choose, as we say, between the world that defines us as black and white. That process led me to ask a lot of questions. When I graduated from high school, I thought, I'm going to change the system, and I'm going to get involved in law. And in getting involved with law, I want to begin to advocate for our community on many different levels. I was young, very naive, but at the same time, very impassioned regarding needing to see social change, especially in the criminal justice system. With that being said, when I entered into John Jay College of Criminal Justice, I had a course, my first course, not in criminal law, not in English and all those basic courses that they think most of us who have Spanish as the first language, English as the second, that we're not able to communicate effectively in the English language. My experience was I studied in the United States, but I was also raised on the island of Borinquen in Puerto Rico. And because of that, I went to the school system there. That made all the difference in the world in my academic development. But that being set aside, when I entered into this class, it was an anthropology class. I didn't even know what anthropology was. But the gentleman that was standing there, Dr. Scott Francher, he looked at me at the end of the class. He said, "Come here." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I need a work study student. Do you want to be my work study student?" And I said, "Well, what is work study?" And he said, "Well, you go to school, but you also get to work in an office. And in this particular case, it's the Department of Anthropology, and we don't really have a secretary. And I thought that maybe you might be an interesting person to have at the front desk." And I said, "Okay, all right, I'll do it. I'll take it." And that's what I did. Little did I realize that what that was going to do was make me have to rethink what is law. Because becoming involved in the field of anthropology really then opened me up to a whole world of laws. I was interfacing as a Puerto Rican kid from New York City between the islands of Puerto Rico and New York with people that were traveling all around the world, that were looking at laws and cultures all around the world. And all of a sudden, my lens opened up. And I thought, what do we mean by law? What do we mean by culture? Until the day came that I made certain kinds of decisions that were essential and necessary for me to reclaim my sense of self, which means having been around so many anthropologists traveling, I needed to have my own experience. And my own experience first started in New York City, started with engaging in the Pan-African movement of cultures that were bringing traditions that had acculturated from the Caribbean islands into New York City. Practices that, in some cases, the codes of law didn't quite treat people as fairly regarding their spiritual beliefs and practices. And I was at the front edge of that. So I began to question. I naturally, because of my experiences and my exposure, naturally then ended up going in and ordaining myself within my own African lineage system that took me ultimately back to Nigeria. But that's a whole other story. Because the key was that once I did that, I began to take a look at the laws of New York City and how they were interfacing with practitioners that didn't quite fit the box at that time. And in particular, I remember getting a newspaper, the Daily News, where they had elders in our tradition who were involved in ceremonies in their own homes, not necessarily in the city setting, involved in their ceremonies, and because it involved certain ways in which we dealt with the four-legged and the winged ones and everything else, all of a sudden you saw blasted Noah's Ark and people getting arrested, and that really upset me because it wasn't really representing what the culture was. So I took a legal pluralism course, right? And I made a paper because I'm going to argue the biases about the codes of law impacting different spiritual practices in the city, but outside the edge of the city, which did not have the same kind of codes. And so with that being said, I wrote my paper because I was going to address what needed to be addressed about how unfair the legal system is, how the codes are, cultural pluralism, and all this. I wrote this paper, and I will never forget the day. I hand that paper over to Serena Nanda, who was my professor at the time, because I was taking courses, but I was also faculty, not faculty, I became an administrative assistant. I worked my way up. I had a permanent job now, so I could literally take courses and not have to pay for them and be in debt. All these things changed my world in terms of how I saw what was possible in my future. And with that being said, I remember the day because I was really nervous. I'm going up the subway. She's going to look at my paper. I bet you she's going to point out things that are not really great in the way I wrote it. But no mind, no care, cleared my mind, ran up to up the steps of John Jay College, got into my office, did my things that I needed to do as an administrative secretary, and 12 o'clock hit, and I'm now going to get ready to go into Serena Nanda's office. She's got my paper. What is she going to tell me? Did I make the arguments on legal pluralism correctly? Was I really too biased? Was I really clear about how the law was interpreting the impact of cultural practices in a city and outside city environment? All these questions were in my head. But no, that's not what she did. I walked in. She had her back to me, beautiful, long, salt, pepper hair. She took her time turning around because she knew my heart was beating so fast, I thought it was going to jump out of my chest. My hands were sweaty. Okay, what's she going to say to me about my paper? So she gently turns around, and a beautiful salt and pepper hair falls on the side of her chair. And she leans over, and she puts her hands on my knee, and she says, Mimi, that was my nickname then. I need to talk to you. I said, okay. I'm trying to see if I could see the paper to see if there's a lot of red marks, and maybe she's going to tell me something about how I write. No. She leaned over and she said, I want to show you something. I see the arguments you're making in law, in cultural pluralism and code. I can see them. But here's the problem. There's a battle inside your head. And I said, what do you mean? She said, there's an argument inside your head. You have all these different cultural influences trying to interpret what an overculture is forcing upon all these cultural influences. And I said, what do you mean? She said, look. And she showed me argument by argument by argument. And I said, whoa, you're right, Serena. She said, Mimi, Marilyn, the war inside you has to stop. You are a blending of cultures. You are not a race. And these cultures are speaking to you. And you've done these ceremonies to move you forward by the influence of the world you have been raised in from 18 to 21 years old, the Department of Anthropology. She said, it's time for you to go and settle those voices inside your head. And I did that. I realized then that I wasn't there to argue law in a criminal justice system. I was there to argue law from an overculture standpoint of view, and how those overcultures create laws that ultimately impact different cultural groups. And that's why we have inequity, and that's why we have misunderstanding, because that's where we have to look. And the criminal justice system and the 8 years I spent at John Jay College, from corrections to police officers, I heard all the stories. They were being trained. In the anthropology department, we were addressing the necessity to look at law, the necessity to look at culture, the necessity to look at community. And in that moment, when I left her office, there was a fire inside me. I said, I am going to travel the world, and I'm going to look at cultures where their points of origin are, and then begin to take a look at whether or not the laws of an overculture really support and understand and are equitable, and what's the history behind that. And so that's my story. My story is that ultimately that journey led me first to go to Africa to honor my ancestor African lineage as a Yoruba descendant of the people of Benin. Then it already had me in Puerto Rico, interfacing at all these different levels with all shades of colors, mixing the Spaniard and the native and the African together. And then I went to the Amazon jungles. Yes, my friends, little kid from Brooklyn. Then I went up to Bali, Indonesia, and sat up at a temple and contemplated on my navel like Buddha. I did all those things to understand from Brazil all around that the issues that we're dealing with here have to do with overculture, and whether those laws really truly understand and are equitable from a historical context of what has happened in America. Because we are intersectional people. We are not a race. We are intersectional cultures blending with an overculture that must own its history. It must. And so I bring that to the table in my story. And I want to dedicate this to my grandmother, my great-grandmother, who I had the privilege right before going to Africa to see for many different reasons. She was 106. And she sat on the porch, Spaniard looking that she was, with her long salt and pepper hair and blue eyes like the Caribbean Sea. a face so wrinkled with time that it made me understand the power of imprinting, the capacity to endure over time the necessary changes of who we are as human beings on this planet, sharing what is essential so that the next 7 generations can live on. That is what she imprinted in me. As I touched her face so wrinkled and her blue eyes and her hair, she couldn't speak completely to me. She was between worlds. And that's how I live, between those worlds. And I'm okay with that because I understand all the cultures that are within me and the war is over. What we must now do is reclaim our sense of humanity and our understanding that this is a larger picture in which the society has to come into alignment with the people it serves. So the song I sing comes from Spain, and it comes in a beautiful way, so I sing it in the Spanish language. That was my first language before English, and now the somewhat not so shaky language of Yoruba that I need to really refine. Y ese santísimo, y ese santísimo, Madre mía de la caridad, ayúdanos y apóyanos en el nombre de Dios. Ay, comisión divina ayer. Ay, comisión divina madre, como Cristo lo enseñó. Ay, comisión divina ayer. Ay, comisión divina madre, como Cristo lo enseñó. Ya a lo lejos se ve una gran caridad. Ya a lo lejos se ve una gran caridad. Y ese santísimo sea que nos viene a acompañar. Muchísimas gracias. Modupuene beleselo dumare, dainoti hanhankatu. Thank you. So with that being said, yeah, y'all can clap. Those who are here, it's good. Now, for me, I hope that this story has hopefully given you some things to think about in terms of what we mean by law and incarceration and the need to redo, right, time in this case. And it is my honor, truly an honor, to introduce Rosa Parker, an extraordinary woman, an extraordinary grandmother, and a woman who understands the nature of the land and the people whose land this first was, wasn't it, right? We got to be real about that. She's been a volunteer. She's done so much work. She's been an advocate. She is, of course, of the American Indian indigenous community of this land. She is widely recognized as an activist because she just hasn't sat back to address change. She's literally gone right to law, legislative law, the very subject that we're talking about, and really talked about House bills that need to be changing, that address missing women in indigenous lands, that addresses girls who are not being protected within their own lands, nonetheless. And she has attended hearings. She has been involved in the signing of the bill by Doug Ducey on May 2019. That's a huge achievement. One that says the very thing we're talking about. The overculture law has to be in alignment with the law of the land, the law of the people, much less respecting the fact of the feminine, because all things are born of woman. And so with that being said, it's an honor for me to have her come and speak to you. She is certified as a deputy registrar for Maricopa County and pays attention to the nature of voting, which we must pay attention to now. Let's give our beautiful woman, Rosa, a welcome. Rosetta, a welcome applause.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for those who are tuning in online. My name is Rosetta Walker, Sikangu Lakota from the Rosebud Sioux tribe in South Dakota, living here on the homelands of the Akmil and A'atam Peeposh peoples. Tonight we're talking about incarceration, Tonight we're talking about how lives have been affected. Tonight we're talking about people like me, one of us. I don't know who's seen the exhibit yet at ASU Museum on Tempe campus, Undoing Time. I have yet to see it because every time I go, the museum is closed. They are open on Friday and Saturday. So make your date and go see the exhibit called Undoing Time. I walk into a room full of strangers, all eyes on me. I stand at the front of the room. Sometimes there's a podium, most of the time not. I look into the sea of strangers and all I see is one of us. You see, I am speaking to an audience of court-ordered attendees at a meeting of the Arizona chapter of Mothers Against Drunk Driving Victim Impact Panel. The men and women have been court-ordered to attend this meeting, a condition of their release from jail or prison. The men and women sitting in the audience are fulfilling their judicial obligations ordered by a judge. I am here to share my story, sharing my personal DUI story, sharing how my choice to drink and drive affected my family, my friends, and professional relationships. It is my way of healing, my way of giving back and letting others know this is not how the story ends. Sharing my pain, shame, embarrassment, and guilt is empowering, letting someone know that one can rise from the ashes. You see, my story started after my release from prison. After my third DUI conviction in 2006, I was charged with aggravated DUI, an automatic Class 4 felony with an automatic prison sentence, a mandatory sentence. That sentence could be anywhere between 120 days to 3.5 years of incarceration in the Arizona Department of Corrections. So I was scooped up after that third DUI, and I was sentenced for my aggravated Class 4 felony by Judge Scales in Gila County in Arizona. I was sentenced after pleading guilty to 120 days in the Arizona Department of Corrections. And my friends said, oh, 120 days, piece of cake. But it was 120 days of my life. During that time, I missed my daughter's 18th birthday. I spent my 25th wedding anniversary in prison, incarcerated, and I spent my 52nd birthday in prison. Nothing to write home about, but it was reality, 120 days of my life. So I look out at those people in the audience that have been released from prison or jail, fulfilling their court-ordered obligation, and I look at them and I think, one of us. I'm a normal person, just like you. I had a good job, paid taxes, sat on the school board, owned my own home, 2 cars in the garage, but I just made a poor choice. And that choice had a consequence. And that consequence I paid dearly with my freedom. Little did I know the impact of my incarceration would have on my family, my friends, and my professional colleagues. But little did I know having to go through the fire would bond us even tighter as a family. My husband had to hold it down, loss of income, My daughter was at her first year of college at ASU. How embarrassing when her birthday rolled around and people would say, "Where's your mom?" For her to have to share, "Oh, she's in prison." How humiliating. How embarrassing and shameful. But we made through it, stronger as we rose from the ashes. One of us. Through all of that, you find out who your friends are. You find out the ones who have your back. You find out the ones who will put money on your books. You find out the ones who will pick you up and not throw you to the ground. When I tell my story, it's healing. But what we do take away from all this is that we're only human. We make choices, maybe not the best, but we rise from the ashes, and we're just one of us. Thank you.
Got it? Okay. Thank you so much, Rosetta, for sharing your story. And in particular, because what your story reveals is that we're all human, right? So for you, when you say each time you tell the story it heals, what part for you at this stage in your life, with all that you've done, you feel it's healing?
I feel that my healing journey is for those that sit in those rooms and maybe have lost hope. They're sitting there very angry. They're sitting there wondering what's next. Where do I go from here? And when I came out of incarceration, I sought out various organizations here in the Valley that help people get back on their feet. I sought out organizations that give you a hand up and not a handout. And it's very interesting in our green room setting tonight with Justin. We have a common denominator. We know a same organization that helped with that hand up, that help you get interview ready again, because, you know, after coming out of incarceration, of course I lost my job, because, you know, I'm making that collect phone call from jail to my employer telling him I don't know when I'll be back. Right. You know, I used to sit on the school board and having to make that collect phone call to the superintendent, you know, saying I'm not going to be at that school board meeting because I don't know when I'm going to get out. Mm-hmm. And I looked to other organizations once I got out, and they were just phenomenal. And one of them that I will point out and who I mentor right now, other women, is called Dress for Success Phoenix.
Oh, nice, yeah.
They've been doing phenomenal work here in the Valley, and the other organization that Justin will speak about in a bit here is Arizona Common Ground, AZ Common Ground. And I tell you, the work that these organizations is just phenomenal, because there's no judgment. Mm-hmm. Because it's like we come in there with a clean slate. Right. And because we're just human.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you so much. And we're going to have a chance to have even a further discussion, but it's always nice to give the person that's sharing their story an opportunity to reflect in that moment and acknowledge what has gotten them from point A to point B, because you don't get to do this by yourself. You get through these processes because you have family, because you have friends, because you have communities, some who've been there and some who haven't. But it doesn't matter. And with that, for me, it is a joy and a pleasure to introduce you to Justin King. Justin King brings a very unique story. First and foremost, one of the things that he shared was that he was raised in Springfield, Illinois, And I'm going to be curious to find out how from Springfield you got to Phoenix, but that's going to be for our discussion. He became involved with the streets. We don't need to tell you the details of the streets, because that's all you need to know. The streets are the streets, and if you're smart enough, and we know we all are, that involves so much. And as a result of that, he was sent to prison at the age of 16, where he spent the next 13 years of his life. No small matter. From that adulting stage to become a man, an adulting man, moving, powerful. During that time, though, he began to reflect, he said. He reflected on his choices. He reflected and did self-examination, and through that process, ultimately, he's free. He's been free for 4 years, and he's dedicated his life to avoiding the trappings of the street life, but more important, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. Let's welcome up Justin King. Give him a round of applause.
Thanks for having me. So just as Marilyn said, that when we talk about the streets, we don't really have to go into detail. We all know what comes along with that lifestyle. It comes with two, inevitabilities. We're talking prison or death. Prison or death, and at some point we all make the decision that we're okay with it, and I don't even understand how we reach that conclusion to accept this, okay? To accept these inevitabilities, to accept this lifestyle. There's a few things that we never take into consideration, and that's what I wanted to talk about today, because there's certain things that happen when these inevitabilities take place, and there are people who are very close to you who are impacted by it, and we never even take into consideration the impact or the collateral of these decisions that we just so willingly embrace in this lifestyle. I don't even know how we rationalize within ourselves that this is okay, but if we were to take into consideration everybody who was affected, everybody who was hurt, everybody who actually felt the wounds of the damage that's caused by us, I think we would be willing to at least consider something else, because the reality is the only thing that we're there for is usually money or reputation, both of which that we can get other places more lucratively and with more prestige, as long as we would apply ourselves. And so, again, I did 13 years, 7 months, and 11 days. So I'll fast forward about halfway through that, some time within the sixth year, I received a visit from my family. It was my mom, my dad, my baby. By the way, I had a baby who was conceived 5 months prior to me being incarcerated. This is another thing that I did not take into consideration, okay? But my family came, and my mom came to share some devastating news to me. I learned that my cousin had died. He'd been killed, actually. And obviously, I was torn up in really bad shape hearing this awful news. And I remember once I finally was able to bring my head up and breathe, I looked over across the table and I saw my 6-year-old son staring back at me. He's got tears glazed over his eyes, not quite crying, but very much into this situation, because at 6 years old, this is the first time that my baby had seen me cry. He had never seen me in this state before. And so fast forward to the end of the visit, it's time for us to give our hugs and part ways. My son came up to me and he gave me the tightest hug, tightest squeeze he's probably ever given me. And this is a 6-year-old boy. He's 6'2" now. He's a big dude. But that would have been the tightest hug that he had ever given me that I can think of. And after he finally let me go, he grabbed me by the hand, turned around, and he started walking me towards the door, towards the exit for the visitors. And once I was able to realize what he was doing, I walked with him a few more paces, but obviously I had to stop at some point. And so I finally stopped, and my baby turned around really quick and looked at me and said, "Come on, Daddy, we gotta go home." And yeah, this is something that people don't take into consideration the impact and the damage that you cause, that your child who has never seen you grieve before, has never seen you cry, is going to be willing to do whatever they can do to console you and to comfort you in that moment. And so afterwards, obviously, I was devastated. I learned about the news of my cousin's death. I was just almost pulled out of the visitor room by my child who wanted to take me home and to comfort me because of that. And again, like, I had to deal with this great sense of powerlessness. What's most frustrating about prison, what's most, not frustrating, it's intolerable, it's unbearable. The thing is in the streets, you're looking to establish power. You go to prison and you have absolutely none. There's no more power. You are in their custody. So again, I felt very much so powerless, and this was something that I wanted to be able to reverse. I did not want to feel powerless. And in that moment, I was like, I got 6 more years of this, okay? And almost in an instant, I also realized I got almost 6 more years of this. I was going to go home one day. I know several guys, several good men who are never going home. Good men with families who made a mistake when they were a kid, just like I had, and were never going to get the opportunity to go home. Not only would they be hugging their kids in visiting rooms, they're probably going to hug their grandkids in these visiting rooms as well. And at that moment, I realized that instead of having this sense of dread of having to do 6 more years, I was able to be grateful that I was able to go home in 6 more years, and that I wanted to start like actively preparing myself. And I know that sounds, it sounds crazy. You think that from the beginning you would prepare yourself, but there's so much that you go through. There's so much that you go through that you can't get to quite to that point. There has to be some catalyst for change. And that situation was very much so the catalyst for it. And so I decided that it was based on my perception. I could change the way that I saw everything. I have control over my thoughts. I have control over my mouth. And so I know that my perception is the greatest thing of value in any situation that I was presented with. So anything that made me comfortable while I was on the inside, and particularly just the treatment of correctional staff and the administration, the conditions. There's several factors. I couldn't possibly name them all that made me uncomfortable. I had to start looking at these situations differently, because if not, then I knew that eventually it would ruin me. It would ruin me, and ultimately I would have, like, what I've noticed about men in prison while I was there is that at some point their inner dialogue, and me as well, I'm not excluded. No one is exempt from this. Your inner dialogue becomes somewhat of a representation of, like, the anger and the hostility you feel because of this powerlessness and because of the treatment that you experience while you're there at the hands of administrations. And I did not want them to have that level of authority over me. I did not want them to have that level of control over me. And so I knew that I would have to start finding a way to change the way I perceive the situation in my head. So at that time, I stopped referring to it as doing my bid. I actually created an acronym out of bid, and it was blessing in disguise. I was going to make all of this a blessing in disguise. I was going to turn all of this into a learning experience and be able to extract some sort of valuable information from whatever, any encounter that I would normally perceive as negative or be negatively impacted by. I wanted to make sure that I didn't let it affect me. And I'm not perfect at it. I'm still not perfect at it. There's times where I realize it's probably 10 seconds in and I realize, you're tripping. But I know that I can reverse it because I know that I have that control in that situation. And so this is something that I really attempt to impress upon young men who are similar to how I was when I was young. I want to give them this information of the powerlessness. Let them consider, or at least be willing to consider, some of the things that they're going to encounter when you're gone. One of the things, when you go to the streets, you automatically accept these inevitabilities, but you don't consider the fact that, like, death happens, period. Death happens unexpectedly. You will lose a family member unexpectedly just by being out here. When it happens while you're gone, it's a whole different type of despair. It's a whole different type of anguish. You have no authority over any. You probably won't even make it to the service unless you pay this absurd amount. You're paying for the gas mileage. Like, imagine what they would pay today with gas prices today. But you lose people. If you're doing 5, 10, 15 years, you're going to lose several loved ones, several of them. And it's going to be hard to recover from that. You're not in an environment where you can grieve properly. You can't grieve, period. One of the things my mother used to do while I was gone, anytime I dealt with a loss in the family, she would come visit me and tell me this information face to face, as opposed to giving me or doing it over a phone call or sending a letter. And one of the things we both just instinctually understood is that we needed each other. We needed each other in order to be able to heal together, in order to grieve together. And a lot of those visits there wasn't a lot of talking. There was a lot of crying, there was praying, but it wasn't that much talking. We just needed to be able to absorb each other's energy. And so I need to explain that. I try to explain this to these young guys who are out here risking their lives, risking their freedom, and risking the sanity of their mothers. You're going to drive your mother crazy. You're going to drive your family crazy. Anybody who loves you, who has to see you in that situation, they're going to lose their mind. You are going to lose your mind several times over again. That's if you're able to recover from the first time you lose it, okay? People ask me that all the time. How did you do all that time and not lose your mind? I did several times over. And every time I had to recover back from it. And that's the value of perception. That's the value of it, because that stops them from being in that control, and that stops you from losing your bearings, because you understand that I can use this situation and I can transmute all of this. I can make this a positive thing. You just have to be willing to. And what I'm suggesting is that you do this now. You do it now before you have to be in that situation and go through it on your own. Because it's just you. Ultimately, it's just you in there. Nothing that you've done out in the streets, none of it matters. It's a clean slate. And everybody, they do all the same stuff that you've done. The only thing is that they've been doing it for a lot longer, and they're immune to it. They're not impressed by who you are in the streets. You have to earn all of that in it. And you don't want to go through that. You really don't want to go through it in the streets. So, in closing, I'm also a spoken word poet, solar just, student of life in reality, and I would like to share a piece. It's called Get It From the Mud. And God said, let there be light, right? Which implies that this was ordained from out of the darkness. So, through the arcs of this catharsis with as heavy of a heart as hearts get, please allow me to impart this. Get it from the mud. With the understanding that when we do so, we're getting it from above, so dig a hole in the soil of your soul and sow your seed. Now seize. A little bit of water is all you need. Now breathe. The ops have no way of stopping properly performed botany. We got this on me. All of your goals are within sight. As long as you pursue them with insight, they'll try to incite you. But their pen is mightier than your sword. Don't let them write you. Because once it's written, it won't be forgiven. See, I'm just like you, in a sense. The only difference is I see your innocence through your militance. I see your brilliance. I see your resilience. You ain't cry because you was in your feelings. You cry because you wanted to kill him. I feel you. But I got to keep it real, too. And I hope it doesn't alarm you, but when I open my arms, it's to disarm you. And I know we're supposed to be thugs, but I'd rather give you some love than to harm you. And I know you in street mode and you stick to the G code, but I peeked through the peephole of your soul when I saw a seat. It was a throne. And that's all I see. And that's why I call you king. Your throne's vacancy is basically taking place because you want to save face in the streets. Whereas your obligation should be to anxiously take your seat, pull it up to the table, be thankful. Say your grace, and then you can eat. Now feast. Peace. Thanks for having me.
Woo! Yeah. Ashe. Ashe. We're supposed to ask questions afterwards, but who dares do something like that with what you just did? Not me. So we want to save some time to have a dialogue. So it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce the next teller. And I say it's an honor because I'm introducing you not only to a traditional teller, but an ordained priestess in the Yoruba West African traditions, who's also my spiritual brother, who I have watched throughout this entire process of his story that he will share. He describes himself as a 56-year-old Puerto Rican, raised between New York City and the island of Borinquen, we know as Puerto Rico. He wants you to know that in the process of his journey, he held the BBA in resource management, an important fact in his story, a master's in education, and that in spite of all that has happened, he's re-engaging his doctorate program. It's always, for me, a joy to hear him speak because his perception paradigm shift is that regardless of what life hands you, regardless of what you encounter, the most important thing is to be at peace with your life and your choices. So let's give my brother, Eshuatelu, my friend, my ally, and to me, a very special person, a warm welcome. You're on, Ceasar.
Hello, and thank you for having me. And as my story is slightly different. I was working in a company, a corporation. I was working there for over a decade. During that time, I had 5 different roles, from customer service representative to senior operations manager. And on April 26, 2012, my 47th birthday, the company got raided. And as I arrived, I was informed that the FBI informed us that we were raided because they were informed there was illegal aliens working on site. Now, the illegal aliens, or so alleged illegal aliens, were working through a temp agency that we outsourced. And as the operations manager, there's a certain knowledge that I carry, but equally, so does the company. So after the ordeal that day, I was advised by the district manager and the legal department not to speak to anyone until they have been notified. Time passed, no follow-up. Business continued as it would on a daily basis. Now, keep in mind, I was informed that corporate attorneys were handling the situation. So at that point, I found myself at ease, at peace with what was going on. But then on February 27, 2013, my boss, the district manager, schedules a meeting for February 28, 2013. And February 28, 2013 comes along. I go to the meeting, but only to be encountered by the HR manager. And at that point, I was informed that I was terminated. And I was like, okay, why? And they said, because you should have known. So at that point, I went into shock. I was not understanding. However, they stated they would give me a ride, provided by the company. And I politely said, no, thank you. I began to walk my way home, completely in shock, asking myself so many different questions. However, I saw my life crumble besides. And I say that because in that precise moment, I realized the position the company put me in and the position the company is protecting itself from. So how was I going to handle this? How am I going to face all of how I've been living? I made a decision. I decided to go home, to return to Puerto Rico, my land, my culture, my community, with the attempt to piece together what had unfolded. I had to act quickly, so I left. I started to recalibrate my life. And one February, I took a trip to visit an elder in New York City. And I received a call from my brother-in-law. And to my surprise, because I usually hear from him through my sister, and he informs me that my house was raided by the FBI. And the FBI agent provided contact information for me to contact them. And so I did. I called, and the agent suddenly informed me that I was being indicted and I should present myself to the FBI office in Houston, Texas. I was like, what the heck is going on? Right? I was like, what agreements were made? So I traveled to Houston before the judge. I obtained legal counsel, and I was informed that I was being indicted for conspiracy in hiring 25 plus illegal aliens. And to me, or for me, there was more that was taking place. Nonetheless, I was informed that I would have to meet with a parole officer on a monthly basis until my trial was set. And I found myself thinking so many different things that I wouldn't be able to say what they are because so many things were just racing through my head. However, I did make it a point to reestablish myself in Houston, so no additional expenses came to my family. I found a job providing educational services to refugees, victims of trafficking, asylees, and I continued working until my sentencing in March of 2017, where I was sentenced to 21 months of incarceration at a minimum security facility. At that point, my sisters broke down a bit. I did not shed a tear, for I understood and trusted that all that was true and not true will show itself. The most important thing to me was that I had to be true to my integrity and to my own truth. And my own truth was not to blame anyone, but to take accountability. And as a priest in my tradition, that is part of moral code. And just taking it and moving forward and trusting the process that will unfold after. And that is one of the reasons that I felt that there's no reason to shed a tear, because I trusted the process. The 25th of May of 2017, I walked into the facility. Prior to that, I made it a point to work all the way until 2 days prior to that to ensure that the company I was working for was able to hire someone to replace me and allowed me the opportunity to train them, to ensure that the services were never affected, the services provided to refugees was never affected. I walked into the facility. The first thing that comes to mind was entering a dorm. There were 4 buildings. Each building held about 125 inmates. At that point, I decided to consider myself entering a monastery and interacting with monks, because I understood as days passed that the inmates were like monks, like Buddhists, a reflection on the decisions and choices people make, as I did myself. Now, the treatment was humiliating, demeaning, inhumane, shameful, and unprofessional, with very few exceptions. I saw the lack of consideration from the staff and the lack of knowledge the staff had to care for other human beings. So much that one day we were in the yard, which is just an open space, and a fellow monk just dropped to the ground. And the staff did not know what to do. So at that point, he passed away. And at that point, I understood where I was. I was in the belly of the whale. And I understood that I needed to protect myself and I needed to make a difference. So I made it a point to keep myself busy. I found a job in the education department, teaching GED classes to the monks. I myself took a culinary arts program, and I kept myself busy. The one thing that was clear to me in all this chaos and personal transformation is that I maintained compassion. Compassion, which is the highest form of love, not only for the people around me, but for myself. I had behind me my families, my friends, my spiritual community. Did I face internal anger? Did I face rejection? I did, as anybody would, being used as a fall person. But then I also took it upon myself to know that it doesn't matter. What matters is that I changed, that I died 1,000 deaths to recover my power that was stripped by a company that took no accountability for what was happening. So I trusted the process with the universe, and Lord and behold, on February 14, 2019, the universe allowed me to walk out of that facility with my head up high, with no shame and no regrets. I was released to a halfway house. 2 weeks later, I returned to the place where I had left. They offered me a job on the spot as an educator, providing classes to the refugee community. And after the interview, trusting, of course, everything that takes place, the accountant stops by and tells me, "Oh, while you were gone, we have a check that you never picked up, and it was in the amount of $1,500. Now, what a blessing, and everything that was taking place. From there, I continued to work. I was offered, in about a week or two, I was offered a full-time position as an online program coordinator. And a month later, I was offered another full-time position, allowing me to do what I do now and what I used to do when I left. A program coordinator providing services to the refugee community and helping them establish themselves and have a better future in the United States. So with this, I really say that this incarceration gave me a freedom, the freedom to know my own truth, the freedom to know my own integrity. And as Rosetta said, to rise from its ashes, claiming my own journey and purpose in life. And there's a proverb in my tradition which states, "Oche di o dice," what is sweet becomes bitter, and what's bitter becomes sweet. So when you're handed lemons, make lemonade and keep it moving. Thank you very much.
So, a housekeeping question, how much time do we have? Let's do 10 minutes. So what I'd like to do in the 10 minutes, because this is so vast, there's so much that was said, that I'm so happy that this has been recorded. Because the stories are rich and give so many different perspectives. And so I think we'd like the 10 minutes to give each speaker a chance to give one message to the audience based on the story that you chose. And audience, thank you so much for being there. We've been looking at all the phenomenal comments, immense, powerful, incredible. Yeah, we could probably do a 2-hour session around all of this at this point. But that's no matter. What matters is the richness of where we are right now. And so I'd like to give each of the persons that spoke an opportunity to give a message to the audience of just why it was so important you came and why it was so important you told the story. So I'd like to begin with Rosetta.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy and honored to be here and share my story with all of you, because I feel, and I've lived through it, if you lived through it, survived it, become empowered from it, then share it.
I'll share. King. I know his name is Justin, but I just love the King name. The King last name. Go ahead.
The absolute same. You are responsible for everything that you know. So when you go through an experience like this, or go through any experience of any impact, you have the responsibility to yourself, for your soul. You owe that to your family and to your community, to share that information, to share that impactful information. If it only means that you can save one person, then you owe that person this story, your story. You have to share it, because it's no longer of much value to you. You've already gone through it. Help someone else to avoid it. That's my objective.
Beautiful. Ceasar Santiago, my brother, go for it.
Well, I believe that one must speak their truth. Everyone has a story, and everyone's story is their own truth. And we must trust in that process. I do want to quote one of my fellow monks. When he was about to leave, he said, "Ceasar, always keep in mind, they care for us like we are dogs. They feed us like we are pigs, but they count us like we are diamonds." So, knowing oneself and moving forward and trusting in our own truth, and not be ashamed to continue to help and to understand and embrace the emotions that took us through the process. Thank you.
And with that, all of you who are out there, thank you for your amazing feedback to these incredible individuals. And to the family and friends that are here, I believe that, yes, it really is time to undo time. And I think the exhibit at ASU, the stories that have been told here, and the opportunity to be able to even hear this and share this affirms the most important thing is that we honor our humanity. Thank you so very much. Muchísimas gracias. Y Ashe Nebelese Olodumare. Good evening and good night.